recording now?
Yeah, I see recording.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll see what we got. Sorry about that, Keto. I think we're good.
Hey, no worries. No worries. So I also, a big part of my job is I'm the T&E species coordinator for the division. And in that respect, I assist our district staff whenever they need some assistance with screening for threatened and endangered species or rare and imperiled community types when they're reviewing wetland, lake, or stream permit applications. I'm also involved with court cases, contested cases, decent amount of enforcement these days, and of course, occasional training like today. So with that, I'm going to try to, it looks like we're getting a little bit of a late start. So I'm going to try to keep this to around an hour so that we have hopefully, 15 minutes or so of question response time at the end. So I might have to fly through some of these slides, but hopefully not. Let's see, I'll get started here. All right, I just wanted to quickly, point out that the Michigan Constitution does recognize that, the natural resources of the state are extremely important to the people of Michigan. And there are some paragraphs in the Constitution that basically provide a kind of a foundation for the Michigan legislature back in the early 80s, I believe it was 82 or so, kind of a pioneering situation. Not many other states were even close to this, but they came up with what we refer to as Part 303, basically the wetland statute in Michigan. And they recognized some things, general functional values of wetlands at the time. And you have to remember that the research, the science, wetland science was pretty young at the time. This was 4 decades ago. So they did a pretty decent job. They put some, what we would consider, some of the bigger general functional values. They actually put that in the statute and statutory rules, and the list is there. Now, back then, of course, they had no way to see that there's some other extremely important functional values that wetlands provide, such as carbon sequestration. Some wetlands like bogs, especially up north, are extremely important in that, which obviously is important with climate change. And of course, the science has matured quite a bit since then in the 40 years. Now, wetland science, there's a lot of science out there, and it's I wouldn't say it's matured, but it's maturing. And of course, in the last 25 years, the technological revolution that we've all experienced, with GIS, geographic information systems, GPS, anything with personal computers, cloud computing, communication, databases have progressed quite a bit. Just digital information and accurate mapping, all those things have kind of revolutionized wetland management in Michigan and beyond. So, the vast amount of wetland science out there and research combined with, the last 25 years of basically a technological revolution has enabled our department to be probably much more consistent in the way we manage wetlands throughout the state. So today I'm not going to be just reading out of the statute or statutory rules verbatim. That would be kind of tedious and not really worth the time. For focus, clarity, and brevity, I've relied a lot on paraphrasing. So my words won't be exact like the statute and rules. I will provide their, various diagrams and photos and some, a handful of real world situations that we can talk about. So again, this is just an intro of what I'll be talking about in the rest of the presentation. Just really quickly, we're going to be talking about the, the 500-foot rule, and then large ponds and 1+ acres of open water and the effects they have on regulating, themselves as wetlands and surrounding wetlands. We'll be talking about various types of surface water connections and how that affects wetland regulation. And then the 1,000-foot rule, when we're talking about Great Lakes and the 3 big connecting rivers, and then wetlands that are more than 5 acres in size. And then we'll talk a bit about the 2019 updates, when the statute was basically updated. Some things were dropped, some things were added, some things were clarified. So some language was added that kind of clarified the T&E, legally protected species, and the effects of wetland regulation there. And I'll talk about that. And the same thing with rare and imperiled communities that are in a list in the statute. and then waters of the United States, WOTUS. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then near the end of the presentation, we'll talk about situations where you have wetlands that are not regulated, such as stormwater retention basins, if applicable, and incidentally created wetlands and open bodies of water that could potentially regulate wetlands or not in mining situations, and incidentally created wetlands with that were created by the construction of upland roadside ditches. We'll talk about that, and a similar situation with upland agricultural areas and wetlands incidentally created in those areas by ditching. And then we'll talk about diked areas associated with landfill, and I think a few other kind of obscure situations. So I'm just going to launch right into this with the 500-foot rule. So basically, if you have a wetland that's within 500 feet of any 1+ acre area of open water, which is pond, and a lake, which is basically 5 acres, at least 5 acres of open water, or any stream and river. So any wetland located within 500 feet of those is potentially regulated. This is probably the most common way that a wetland is regulated by EGLE. Now, keep in mind, a wetland can be regulated various ways. Through the 500-foot rule, it can be regulated by size, if it's more than 5 acres, surface connections to other water, surface water to the state. So just keep that in mind. And when we talk about these various rules, we'll kind of set the others aside just for simplicity. And again, I'll talk about these in a few slides throughout the presentation, but I use, and a lot of my fellow professionals use, Wetland Map Viewer. It's like a kind of a quick and dirty GIS system where you don't have to have the expensive systems to look at lots of different information on there, including National Wetland Inventory, NRCS hydric soils data set, the National Hydro data set, NHD, which is kind of like it's kind of like NWI though for streams. Again, it's not completely exhaustive, inclusive, but it has a lot of the streams. And then of course I use Google Earth Pro, especially for historical imagery. And of course the imagery of the last few years is extremely high resolution. And then our own, EGLE's own My Water GIS layers that, we can see, as EGLE staff, we see on our side, and then on the public side are available as well. And they're kind of like Wetland Map Viewer, have a lot of those same data layers on there. So of course, if you have to, you can go out and use high accuracy GPS in the field to figure out if something is, a wetland is 500 feet from, open water or a stream or a river. And with streams, rivers, lakes, large ponds, you generally measure to the ordinary high water mark from that wetland. Okay, so again, just to keep things really simple, we're just gonna, for the moment, forget about all the various other ways that a wetland can be potentially regulated. Okay, we're talking about the 500-foot rule only. So in this case, in this diagram, we have a stream. We have our scale bar with 500 feet, this little wetland, disjunct kind of out here by itself, over 500 feet away, this wetland within 500 feet. So we're just keeping it simple here, but if it falls within 500 feet of the ordinary high water mark of that stream or river, or any other, large pond, 1 acre plus open water lake, then it's regulated typically. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit about large ponds and 1+ acre of open water. Now this might be new to some of you out there, and it kind of mystifies some people still. But we've been the department's been doing it this way for a long time, probably at least since the early 2000s, and for as long as I've been involved in this position. So a large pond is at least 1 acre of permanent open water. You can say during most years within a recent 10-year period. So most of the time, it's got at least 1 acre of permanent open water. This doesn't include, heavy-duty drought years and things like that. Now, this is important. So to count it as open water, it's basically has to be unobstructed, inundated area of water containing few or no emergent stems. So if you think of a cattail marsh or a cattail fringe, that would not count as open water. Also would not include any rooted woody vegetation, such as think about buttonbush. You know, you can have a very wet buttonbush swamp that is water all around it, permanent water basically all year. But if you have shrubs such as buttonbush or willow or anything or holly emerging from that water, then that would not be factored in as part of the 1 acre of permanent open water. So this is important to remember. Open water can be seasonally covered in duckweed, so floating vegetation, you know, algae, or lily pads, which includes, you know, both of our species of lily pads, including the newfar species, you know, the water pondweed, which can it can raise above the water somewhat, especially in really shallow systems, but even in deeper systems, it can raise above the water a bit. Keep in mind, those stems are actually fairly buoyant. They're basically kind of floating up. And if you took that water away, they would just lay flat. So we count both species of lily pads as non-emergent in this situation. So anything that floats, any algae or the species of lily pads on the water, it's still open water. If there are no other emergent stems, such as bulrushes, cattails, you know, buttonbush, anything else in that area. So in this example, we have our, you know, our typical, you know, dense cattail fringe along the side, emergent stems. We don't count that as part of the open water. And in this, it's relatively open, few, if hopefully basically no, but can be a few here and there emergent stems. That would count as 1+ acre open water. Okay. So, and we'll be revisiting this a few times as well, but this pond basically would also normally count as a wetland. So it can be regulating itself because it has 1+ acre of open water, right? So that's key. And then it potentially regulates anything within 500 feet around it, any other wetlands. So in this case, you have a small wetland within 500 feet. It's regulated by that 1+ acre of open water. This little wetland is not. And we're assuming that these wetlands have no other surface connections or anything else that I'll deal with here in a second. So this slide's pretty important. This might be new to some people, but it's not new to EGLE. All right. Along this the same vein, 500 feet of 1+ acre of open water. Okay, this is just basically an example. A couple years ago, I had a website where on the neighboring property, I discovered within 500 feet, there was this probably about 3 acre pond. And when I looked at aerial photos of that, I could see that in the spring and late fall, it looked like the situation on the right. It was well over 1 acre of open water, had a little bit of fringe along the edges, but that open water, in this case, the really dark reflectance, was well over 1 acre. And looking back to the last 10 or so recent years, that was the case. When you look at some of the aerials that show it in midsummer, it looked like this on the left. And to me, that looked a lot like lily pads. And sure enough, when I was on site, confirmed that, yes, it's just lily pads. You know, this thing's still pretty deep, you know, at least 15 feet deep or so. And it's just covered by floating vegetation, essentially. So that's still considered open water, basically all year. So this would be a self-regulating wetland. It was off-site, so it wasn't part of that particular WIP, but it definitely influenced the nearby wetlands. It regulated the nearby wetlands on the other site because it had 1+ acre of more or less permanent open water. Okay, so this is that same pond. Just breaking it down into a diagram for you. It had definitely over 1 acre of open water. So any wetlands within 500 feet, assuming they didn't have any other connections or whatever. This is just breaking it down, just the 500-foot rule. These two wetlands, you know, this one's partially in, this one's in. They're both regulated because of this large pond. This wetland's way out, so it's not. This is really common. You know, 1+ acre of open water situation. Just keep in mind that those ponds are also considered to be wetlands, and they can kind of be self-regulating if they do have 1+ acre of open water. So I'll be talking about another aspect of stormwater ponds later, and how they themselves might not be regulated if they meet certain criteria. They might not be regulated as wetlands, but regardless of that, if a stormwater pond has at least 1+ acre of open water, permanent, whether it's regulated as a wetland or not, can still regulate anything within 500 feet, any other wetlands within 500 feet of it, or anything that flows, any wetlands that flow into it. So this is very important. This does confuse people. You know, in the last 9+ years that I've been running the WIP program, you know, we've been adhering to this, and this is not a new change. It's just, it could be new to some people, but it's been around for a while, the way we do this. So just keep that in mind. You know, these are, you know, they can be a designed stormwater pond, but if it's basically 1+ acre of open water permanently, it can regulate wetlands around it. Okay, I just want to mention that the 500-foot rule is nearly universal. It's very common, and it will apply unless it's determined by EGLE that there is no groundwater connection to a surface water body. You know, back when they wrote the statute and statutory rules, it was assumed by the science that they had at the time, and it's probably fairly correct, that because of Michigan's, you know, unique glacial geology, that nearly all wetlands are connected hydrologically to a stream or a large body of open water somewhere at some point. So that's where the 500-foot rule came about. Now, there is a provision if you know, a consultant or applicant wants to try to prove that even though a wetland is within 500 feet of a stream or another large open body of water on the surface, you can try to prove that it's not connected via groundwater, right? And the 500-foot rule assumes that all wetlands are connected via groundwater to other waters of the state. So to try to prove that, it would need to be done via the level 3 WIP verification process. And in my tenure with the WIP program, this has been attempted twice. And of course, this would entail quite a large hydrogeo study. And you basically would be showing that, you know, you have landfill grade clay underneath the wetland and all around the wetland, completely separating it from surface waters of the state. And so in the 2 times where we, you know, during level 3 WIP, EGLE staff eventually went out, checked out the site with the consultant, and we started doing test borings of our own. We actually found that there were saturated soil conditions. It was more of there were loams present, in some cases sand lenses present, and it was pretty obvious that water could escape that wetland in the groundwater and get to the nearby river and stream. So basically, both of those failed to prove that they were not subsurface connection to waters of the state. So, all right, so now I'm going to talk about surface water connections. All right, Todd, I'm just going to check with you. You guys can hear me fine?
Yep, it's all
Okay,
good.
excellent.
You'll
All
see
right,
everything.
crickets out there, of course, so I just want to make sure
I know.
this is not talking to my computer for an hour.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so we're going to move on to surface water connections. Now, some of these are very straightforward, and some of these are probably going to kind of blow your mind, some people's minds. But we've been doing this for a long time this way. Very common way that wetlands are regulated by EGLE. Make sure you look carefully. I think it's safe to say that majority of wetlands have some sort of outlet if you really look carefully. Now, that can be obscured depending on the time of season you're out there. But oftentimes, if you're out there in early spring, late winter, when wetlands are full or filling up, or after several day big storm events, any other time of the year, you can see some sort of outlet in a lot of wetlands. Not all of them for sure. So surface water connections include seasonal or intermittent flow to or from. The or from part isn't very common, but I have seen it from time to time. A stream, lake, or large pond. And it includes overland flows such as from annual flooding events. So seasonal intermittent direct surface water connections can include ditches, swale, storm sewer pipes, so almost any sort of pipe, and culvert or tile. We're going to talk about swale connections first. Now, this is just an example of obviously, you know, mowed, non-wetland, designed swale. Let's just say that up gradient, there's a wetland. Occasionally, probably in the spring or after massive thunderstorms, water will flow down through this non-wetland situation, this swale, and potentially could reach surface waters of the state, such as large ponds, lakes, or streams and rivers. If it does, the wetland that's way up gradient would be regulated via surface connection, even though this is not a stream in between, and this is potentially not even a wetland. So pretty common. Another example, this was taken in March a year ago or so. So we didn't have any snow at the time, but you can see up gradient, you can see ice. That's basically a shrub swamp that this swale kind of leads from. And maybe not the best picture, and maybe, you know, this swale might have been, looks like it was enhanced, you know, by people over, you know, probably many decades ago to try to drain that wetland or whatever. But I just want to point out there was no wetland vegetation in the bottom of this, or no hydric soils. So there's even this pretty good healthy black cherry tree and other upland vegetation growing in the bottom of this. It was not a wetland, but occasionally you could see such a scenario where that upstream, or I shouldn't say upstream, that up gradients wetland, in this case shrub swamp, could kind of overflow, especially during early spring or big storm events, and flow down through this non-wetland swale. And assuming there's a stream or surface water of the state located the other end of this, and it might be combined with, you know, another ditch or something like that, then this wetland up gradient would be potentially regulated by that connection, that surface water connection. And again, it doesn't have to be wetland in the swale. It doesn't have to be a stream, almost any sort of surface connection. And then you look for, in many cases, actually, it's not as obvious even as that. You're just looking for non-wetland drainage patterns, you know, that you see maybe in floodplains, or I've seen this. This is actually not a greatest photo, but if this was actually more or less like a shallow gradient hillside, it has big wetlands that would kind of overflow and stair step down through non-wetland into another wetland, and then overflow and then go into another wetland. And then in between, you could see the surface scouring. There was really no channel or anything like that. You would no way call this a stream, hardly even call it a swale, but you could see where water occasionally would move across the landscape. And again, that's a surface connection as well. Okay, so still talking about surface water connections. Again, we're just keeping it simple, assuming there are no, you know, we're not going to talk about right now the other ways that a wetland can be regulated. But in this case, let's just, okay, we'll assume both are over 500 feet away, but this small wetland is connected through some sort of surface water connection to that stream. This could be a ditch, swale, pipe, anything like that. This wetland is not, so it's not regulated. Now, the next slide, if this other wetland, in fact, had a surface connection to this southern wetland, then we would assume, you know, water obviously would occasionally, intermittently at least, flow into this wetland and then flow out of this wetland, through this wetland, out to the stream. So in that case, they're both regulated, even though they're both over 500 feet away and relatively small. This is just a real world situation. I believe this was last year, a level 3 website in West Michigan. And consultant's delineation was pretty good, but there was some question, they had some question of whether this wetland C was actually regulated or not. And wetland D was pretty obvious, very wet. And in fact, we had an NHD stream that was already mapped, you know, some of those online resources I could see without even hunting down, you know, on site over here and see if it was a stream. It was pretty obvious in the aerials, and it was mapped as NHD. So we knew wetland D was definitely regulated, you know, outflow to a stream within 500 feet of a stream. Wetland C, technically it was over 500 feet from that stream. However, on site, wetland C is quite a bit higher than wetland D in the stream. And I was able to come up, well, this is what wetland C looked like. So quite a bit of water in there from time to time. And I found that the southeast portion of that was kind of several inches higher, kind of a mesic, you know, not quite wetland area. And then I found that there was a kind of a shrub infested gully that was hard to identify at first, but it appeared to lead from wetland C to wetland D. And then I utilized LiDAR. We have a really good GIS department. These guys really help our staff out quite a bit when asked, and they were able to find some LiDAR, which is basically just laser radar. So an aircraft will fly over an area and using lasers to basically determine what the topo is. And it can be very high resolution. We're talking, inches of accuracy. So with this LiDAR in hand, it was pretty obvious to me that, yeah, Wetlands does occasionally, and over the eons, has kind of scoured out this non-wetland channel from intermittent overflow down into Wetland D. So Wetland C and all the watershed up here, intermittently, occasionally, probably early spring and after big storms, ends up in Wetland D. And then if we go back to, showing the aerial, ends up in Wetland D, goes through Wetland D to the stream. So Wetland C was actually regulated as well, even though it's well over 500 feet from the stream. So just mentioning, just another side note about the LiDAR situation. I've heard recently that approximately 65% of the state now has been flown with LiDAR, basically is available to the public. LiDAR is a little different. Apparently you just can't pull those maps off of, we don't have those in Wetland Map Viewer or anything like that. You have to pull kind of the raw data off, which is free, and if you know where to get it. And then you'll have to know your way or know somebody who's adept at GIS to make those maps for you, those digital elevation model maps, which are extremely useful. Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about pipes, storm sewer pipe connection especially. These situations, and again, this could blow some people's minds who haven't been delineating or working with wetlands in the state of Michigan. But just be aware that the department, we had a declaratory ruling in 2016, which supports EGLE's position on this, that storm sewer pipes, the water within pipes remains surface water while in that pipe. And this goes back at least until the early 2000s. We had some guidance on that at the time. And as long as I've been doing this, the last 9+ years, we've been doing it this way as well. So we'll talk a little bit about this. So if a storm sewer remains in that storm sewer and actually leads to a stream or large surface water body, then potentially it's still surface water connection and would regulate that wetland. Now, if a storm sewer pipe mixes with a sanitary sewer network and goes to a sewage treatment facility, then it's no longer a potential wetland regulatory connection. That usually just kind of terminates it right there. So if that's the only way a wetland could it be regulated, it would not be regulated. But if storm sewer, and you're seeing municipalities separate these more and more, obviously they don't, it's not good to have your storm sewers mixed with your sanitary sewers. It just causes sanitary sewer overflow from time to time into rivers, which is no good. So these are being separated more and more. And in most situations, probably storm sewers are not mixed with sanitary sewers. And not always. Sometimes they'll just go to a large infiltration basin and not really connect to a stream or waters of the state. But oftentimes storm sewers go to a stream or a lake, but oftentimes a stream, which would potentially regulate any connected wetlands up gradient. So just a real world scenario from a couple years ago, a whip in Canton. It was quite a big site. Most of the wetlands ended up flowing to this point over here, which would, to me, looked like an inlet to a storm sewer. It did go underneath kind of a big boulevard highway. But I was thinking, okay, that goes somewhere, probably to a nearby stream. And that nearby stream, the closest one was Apple Run over here. And here was the outflow pipe. And here's the diagram. So most of the wetlands on site ended up here at this inlet to the storm sewer. Municipal mapping showed that, yes, in fact, the storm sewer goes underneath this highway and then right to Apple Run. Now, those municipal maps obviously are going to oftentimes be available. All municipalities should have those. They need those when they need that data when they're upgrading their storm sewers network. Obviously, they have to know where those things are buried. So you can obtain those if you asked. This is another situation. This is a Troy WIP in 2019. Pretty big site, a lot of big wetlands on site. A lot of the water from those wetlands drained to the southeast corner where it was also very wet and wetland, and I could not find any ditches leading off site to a stream. Further inspection eventually revealed not the best looking thing, but this was a hidden storm sewer inlet. And again, the maps from the local municipality showed that, yes, all the water came in here to this inlet, zigged and zagged a little bit, but more or less went under this road, this boulevard, highway, whatever, to the Sturgis drain. So these wetlands, even though in a very fragmented urban, suburban landscape, still connected to the stream. So these wetlands were regulated, even though they're far from the stream. Well, much more than 500 feet anyway. We're like 1,500 feet or so. All right, this slide just basically shows that situations are often not super straightforward. They're pretty complex. I mean, one wetland, let's just say this small, right? All these wetlands, let's say, are 500 feet or more than 500 feet from a stream. This one potentially would overflow, and some of that water would end up in a stormwater basin, which by itself, that basin is considered a wetland, but it might not be regulated wetland. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But nonetheless, water is going to pass through that typically and end up in a storm sewer. In this case, you have some wetlands that are pretty far from the stream, little wetlands that one's connected to a swale. We could call that a ditch, or any sort of pipe to another wetland, and then any sort of surface water connection, including a pipe to that storm sewer. And eventually that water would go to that stream. So at least these three wetlands are regulated. The stormwater basin wetland may or may not be. We'll talk about that. So I think I just kind of went over this. It can be a whole assortment of ditches, culverts, stormwater piping, stormwater basin, other wetlands. And again, this little wetland, because it does flow some sort of surface connection to this large self-regulating 5+ acre wetland. And then that big wetland has a connection to the stream. Now, I think the next slide, if that large wetland did not have a connection to the stream, it might still be regulated because it's over 5 acres in size. But regardless of any connection from the little wetland to that wetland, has no bearing on whether that little wetland is regulated, because ultimately is not connected to surface waters of the state. All right, I'll just briefly talk about some of these tools. I know I already did. The NHD, the National Hydro Data Set mapping is excellent, but it's not a full representation of all the streams out there. You still, oftentimes I find streams that are not within that data set, but it gives you a good place to start. You can find that in Wetland Map Viewer and also on our My Waters site. Of course, high-res leaf-off aerials when you're looking for surface water connections. Some of the aerials from the past 10 years are extremely high resolution, and if leaf-off, if you know what you're looking for, are extremely helpful. Topo maps, we have even like the 1970s from Wetland Map Viewer, are on Wetland Map Viewer from the 1970s. Unfortunately, we don't have LiDAR yet on Wetland Map Viewer. Maybe at some point we will. But you can find LiDAR as well. I'll just skip down to LiDAR. Digital elevation model, if you can find the data, which I said a lot of it is free and available throughout the state. And if you can build a DEM, digital elevation model out of that, this is another LiDAR example and this was a website I had a few years ago, and the actual subject wetland was up in here, no streams anywhere near, but you can see with the LiDAR, I could see this potential naturalized surface water, you can say just naturalized swale going through the landscape, kind of blew out an old 2-track area down here and potentially went onward to a stream. So LiDAR is extremely useful for looking for these sorts of surface water connections. And of course, hydric soils mapping, I mentioned that because even if an actual stream or something has been moved on the landscape, rerouted, the old hydric soils networks show you potentially where the linear wetlands or streams were, and oftentimes the landscape is still that way, and it might direct water through those areas as well. So okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit here into the 1,000-foot rule, just like the 500-foot rule, but it applies to the edges of the Great Lakes in Michigan. and then the three big connecting rivers. So up in here, and here. So any wetlands within that 1,000-foot zone of the lakeshore, those three connecting rivers would be regulated potentially. This does not include the other Army Corps of Engineers Section 10 waters, such as drowned river mouth, lakes, and lower river section. And this next slide kind of puts this together, where we have White Lake is an example of a natural drowned river mouth lake in West Michigan. Through glacier activity and sand dunes, this lake has formed up, kind of naturally dammed itself off, always more or less had a connection, which has been enhanced now to Lake Michigan. But the White River flows into here and then flows out. It is not considered, one of those connecting rivers or anything like that. So you end up with a 1,000-foot zone along, in this case, Lake Michigan. Any wetlands found within that 1,000-foot zone would be regulated by Lake Michigan. And on White Lake, even though it's very close and it's connected to Lake Michigan, the 500-foot rule applies. So any wetlands found within this 500-foot zone would be regulated by White Lake, by this large, vast amount of open water. Also to note, any wetlands outside of these zones that actually have a surface water connection to either White Lake or Lake Michigan, obviously those would be regulated as well. All right, we're going to talk about wetlands that are more than 5 acres in size. These typically straightforward, but we're sometimes not so much. And you're going to use a combination of aerials, National Wetland Inventory, hydrosoils mapping. Again, you can find those in Wetland Map Viewer. And then high-res aerials, historical aerials, especially on Google Earth Pro, and on My Waters, you can find NWI and hydrosoils mapping. I just want to point out, it's not typical to micro delineate small areas of potential upland, especially when you're doing a desktop analysis. Just, delineate basically the whole wetland complex. And our staff are lucky. We have, the Wetland Lake and Stream Unit, GIS crew to assist with review of tough sites like this from the desktop analysis situation. I'm going to talk a bit about artificial barriers in wetlands. And what it comes down to is basically any roadway, dike, berm, anything like that, although it itself would potentially not be wetland, it cannot destroy the contiguity of that wetland. And I'll show you some examples. But sometimes these can be easy to identify. Oftentimes these are missed, but situations where you have a road going through a wetland, obviously pretty easy. Now, some old 2 tracks or logging roads have built up a little bit, not so easy. And if sometimes they've sunken or lost enough carbon or settled enough where, the old 2 track is still wetland. So be on the lookout for that as well. But any dike, roadway, berm that's unnatural does not break the contiguity of that wetland. Our own staff and wetland professionals have to keep in mind that if a road or some other project, any sort of fill breaks up a wetland, it doesn't break the contiguity necessarily, but those remaining pieces might be less than 5 acres in size. And if they're not connected to a stream or open water of the state in another way, that could potentially unregulate them. So our staff have to keep in mind that it might be applicable to apply conservation easements in some of those cases, just to protect those remaining wetlands on the landscape. Okay, here's an example. Let's just say that, we look at aerials, we say, oh, okay, this was pretty obviously, one contiguous wetland on the landscape. This road was put in actually many decades ago. This is a paved/dirt road. It's been there for a long time. Checking out National Wetland Inventory in the green, the hydric soils in the brown here, it just kind of validates, yes, that was one wetland system at one time. This Cloverdale Road breaks it up. Obviously, this area where the road is not wetland anymore, but both units are contiguous to each other. So if both units add up to more than 5 acres, then no worries at the moment because they're both basically still regulated as if they were one. So there doesn't have to be a culvert there or anything like that. Any artificial road or berm or anything like that, even without a culvert, the remaining pieces of that wetland are treated basically as one. It doesn't break the contiguity. So this is a concept that is oftentimes overlooked. And then this is actually another slide. And the only thing that changed here is let's just assume that this wetland has an overland flow of some sort to a stream or or lake or large pond. Again, the road does not break the contiguity. So even without a culvert, if this side is regulated, and it would be because of the surface water connection, then this is as well. So this is a pretty important concept. Let me back up and say that, a lot of this is pretty straightforward. You just have to remember that, artificial barriers and berms and roads do not break the contiguity of a wetland. And again, it's oftentimes overlooked, even though, the department's been doing this for decades, many decades. Again, this is kind of a little bit of recap, but by itself, a large wetland cannot regulate other wetlands unless it contains 1+ acre of open water. If this does not have a large area of open water and it's not connected, this large wetland is not connected to a stream or a large area of open water, then it doesn't matter about any connection to the small wetland. The small wetland would be potentially unregulated. Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the things that were added or kind of tweaked in the statute in 2019. So wetland theoretically could be regulated because of the presence or likely presence of a protected species. It can be threatened, endangered federally or state. Special concern does not apply. That's not really legal protection. But if you have a wetland where there's very likely that it does have a protected species within it, it's automatically regulated. I would just add a note that most wetlands that have high quality habitat that would have teeny species are already regulated just because of size, or a lot of those wetland types are near at least headwater streams or open areas of water. So this is just kind of a scenario just to show you. This is basically what our staff on the internal side of My Waters might see. We have available these secure layers, MNFI element occurrence layers. In this case, it's showing a rare or vulnerable ecological community type outlined in green. And if our staff click on that, they can see what it is, when it was observed by MNFI, and some other data regarding that. And we could say the red potentially is an animal and the blue is a plant, a protected plant element occurrence. So in this case, I just want to point out that some of the wetlands, smaller wetlands, I mean, we don't see a stream anywhere here, and we could assume that maybe this wetland, this little wetland down here to the east, southeast, let's just say it's not attached to this wetland. There's a natural upland break. May or may not be the case, but for now, let's assume that it was. Now, if this element occurrence is actually Massasauga rattlesnake or spotted turtle or other various animal species, or even some plant species, it's safe to assume that if Massasauga or spotted turtle are inhabiting here, are known to occur in this ecological community, then they're probably in here too. We know Massasaugas will go across the landscape, especially in summer. They'll go into upland, they'll go into surrounding wetlands, traveling far and wide from their hibernaculum sites. So more than likely, if Massasauga are here, then they're going to be in the small wetland as well. And same thing with spotted turtle and a host of other state or federal protected species. So our staff are trained to look for nearby element occurrences and pick up on certain habitat types. And especially if an element occurrence is nearby the subject wetland, and that wetland is a similar type and could be used by that species, and that wetland would be automatically regulated. And this slide just, basically if staff are unsure, that's when they oftentimes contact me. And then in 2019 also, some of the language in the statute was changed regarding rare and imperiled community types. And it was kind of, you can see it was kind of nebulous, it's kind of vague. And to my knowledge, I don't think the department ever really acted on this. There were situations where we were thinking about it, but again, it's so kind of gray language that we needed to have that primo example, especially as a first one, and never really did it. Now in 2019, it was clarified. Basically, rare and imperiled wetlands that are within a list now in the statute are automatically regulated by EGLE. So I'll show you that list. This is the list as of 2019. Now, there's provision in the statute where every 5 years, DNR can actually update this list, add to it, take away. Realistically, some other, especially some of the forested types of wetland systems should be added to this list. But at the moment, it's really just southern floodplain forest, and muskeg is kind of almost a forested system, but not really. Also keep in mind that most of these community types would be already regulated in most situations. They're like, for example, prairie fen, almost every situation they're involved with, headwater streams. A lot of these things, involve, or coastal fen obviously would be regulated anyway. Coastal plain marsh may or may not, actually, they can be fairly disjunct. And Great Lakes marsh obviously is going to be regulated anyway. Lake Plain, Wake Mystic Prairie might be, might not be. That's one of those, along with possible wet prairie fragments, which might be far enough away from a stream where this would be the only way that they might be regulated to be on this list. Another one we've run into is interdunal wetlands. They can be over 1,000 feet from the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan, and still be influenced by that Great Lake hydrologically. And not be anywhere near a stream. And so if they qualify as an interdunal wetland ecosystem, then they're regulated. I'd say muskeg typically is, it's a treed bog. Bogs are not usually associated with streams, although they might have some little streams exiting them. So that may or may not be regulated unless in other ways, I should say. So just a side note to that, this does not affect which wetlands can be preserved under Part 303 mitigation rule. Our staff might accept, depending on the situation, great examples of other vulnerable ecological communities. Good examples of possibly rich conifer swamp or hardwood conifer swamp, especially if they look like this with really old cedars and all kinds of other awesome, functional value, even though they're not on that list in the statute. But what that list does specify is which wetlands must be mitigated at least a 5-to-1 ratio. All right, just kind of moving on briefly to waters of the US. In 2019, our statute, Michigan Wetland Statute, was tied to the federal waters of the US rule. It basically means that anything regulated via waters of the US would also now be regulated in Michigan via our statute. So if something, and we, I'd say the first couple years, maybe a year and a half or so, when it was still kind of what was referred to as the Obama rule, in some situations might have been a little bit more protective than our own statute. And we were trying to keep track of those situations where we might not have regulated a wetland in a certain situation and waters of the US did. And I could probably have counted those on both of my hands. It was not too many. And then the next rule was present for a couple years, and that waters of the US rule regulated a lot less probably than what our statute did. Now, both of those rules from both recent administrations have been abandoned, and a new WOTUS rule has been proposed. It seems like they're really taking their time. The Corps and EPA are really taking their time in crafting this one. They want to make sure it sticks around for a while, can survive, court case situations. And right now, I think and it's 2 phases. And the first phase is, I believe, still in a comment period. So we just kind of put that on the back burner for a while. Okay. Let's see, how are we doing on time here, Todd?
Oh, I think we're okay. We're at 11. So I don't know, 10,
Okay.
10, 15 more minutes.
Okay, cool. I'm going to talk about wetlands that are potentially not under EGLE jurisdiction for the last part of this presentation. So, okay, now finally, we're going to talk about the stormwater retention detention facility situation. Now, as we saw earlier, if they have 1 acre, if these systems have, more than 1 acre of open water, relatively permanent, they can regulate wetlands within, 500 feet of them, or any wetlands that flow into those. Those systems themselves might be considered non-regulated wetland if they meet a few criteria. So basically what we want to see is proof that the system was designed as a stormwater facility. Now, there are certain situations where, you have definitely an industrial type of stormwater facility that was obviously designed for that function. But in most cases, we're going to want to see some evidence, whether that be plans, specs, any other, municipal permit documentation regarding that, permitting that stormwater facility. And the department will need to see proof of pre-existing non-wetland. So as a consultant, that's up to you to basically prove, usually by examining historical aerials and NRCS hydric soils data. Both of those combined, oftentimes sufficient to go back and look at the area before that footprint, before that facility was built, and determine if that was likely wetland or not. And to check up on this, I know via some whips in the past, we've looked at, 1965 or 1960s aerial photos combined with hydric soils, usually sufficient. Sometimes we've even looked at 1938s, basically stuff that's before World War II. And I know in one case, I looked at it, I'm like, oh, that was an apple orchard right there. So good to go. Okay, it wasn't wetland. So again, if you meet both of these criteria, then that stormwater facility would not be regulated. It would be wetland, but not regulated wetland. So this is key. This comes up all the time. I know during whips and probably, throughout the state when our permit staff are reviewing permit applications. Okay, just back to this slide again. Kind of harping on this again, I guess a little bit, but this was a real world scenario. This actually went to a contested case a few years ago. The property was more or less over here. This large stormwater pond was off-site. So we didn't go over there, but it was clearly looking at aerials. It was something like 3 acres, I believe, of permanent open water every year. Well within 500 feet of the subject wetlands. Now, these subject wetlands we found when we were on site actually flowed seasonally or intermittently to a county drain that, although it may or may not have been a stream, it definitely went right to Lake St. Clair. And so we called this whole thing regulated, and kind of in our back pocket, we knew it was regulated 2 different ways, the direct way here and also via the 1+ acre of open water, 500 foot away or less than 500 feet away. So we did win that contested case, but I guess I'm just pointing out that this stormwater basin probably wasn't itself considered regulated wetland, although that wasn't part of the subject situation, but it was clearly designed, and it may or may not have been, if it was not built in wetland, then it would have been exempt from being regulated. However, it was large, open water, permanent open water, and would have regulated this wetland. So it turns out this wetland was regulated 2 different ways. Okay, so talk a bit about incidentally created wetlands as part of commercial mine situations. This is pretty common, and basically the exemption applies if the area was not wetland prior to excavation, and it applies until that commercial mining is no longer being used for that purpose. And for your massive mines, say in the UP, big iron mines where the iron ore was extracted, and then say a whole segment of that was kind of decommissioned and mining is done there, and it was allowed to be naturalized and whatnot. In that situation, that portion would be considered not not within commercial mining anymore, and potentially the wetlands on site would be jurisdictional, depending on other factors that we discussed. And it's also important to note that any large surface water bodies that were created during the mining, when the mining is active, those surface water bodies cannot be used to regulate surrounding wetlands as well. So kind of a two-pronged thing there. Now, let's see, so the next is a great example showing this is a very large gravel mine west of Grand Rapids, I think around Allendale, not far from the Grand River. Back in the mid-90s, aerials show that this was actually, yes, definitely a mine. You know, it wasn't residential, it was actually a gravel mine. And they were in the process of creating some very large open water areas. And then aerials from a few years ago show that this is not a gravel, it's the same area, but the gravel mine is done, completed, and look at all the houses that are around all these open water areas. Definitely not a mine situation anymore. And because it's not an active mine, you know, those kind of exemptions don't apply anymore. So all these, we can assume that all these, this one might be close, but this little open water area over here in the east, but let's just assume they're all 1+ acre open water. Potentially they would regulate any wetlands within that 500-foot, you know, radius from those. And then of course, any wetlands outside of that 500-foot that have any sort of surface connection to that surface water. So I think that's fairly straightforward. If the mine is actually functioning as a mine, that's one thing. If it's not, if it's functioning as differently, it's not a mine anymore, then it just applies to normal situation. This is okay. So diked areas associated with a landfill footprints, permitted landfill situation. I run into these maybe once every 2 years. One of these where landfill is just kind of doing its due diligence. They're concerned that they have, just because of the way things were graded on site or not graded or whatever, they had wetlands developed in lower areas. And over a few years, of course, you can develop some hydric soil and wetland plants, and you might actually have actual wetlands like up in the landfill in sort of, low trough areas. And basically, if it's a permitted landfill and there weren't wetlands there previously, and if within that diked, outer footprint area, they're just incidentally created and they're basically exempt from regulation. Okay, moving on to another situation where from time to time I encounter this, but it's not really that common, and I'll explain why. So if you have roads that are being built or built, and of course, associated with most roads, you have ditches. Now most of us know that in the bottoms of some ditches, depending on their gradient or whatever, can develop wetland, hydric soils, wetland plants, definitely have the hydrology. However, if that road and those ditches were only built in upland and only built to drain upland, there are no wetlands up gradient that they also drain, then any wetlands that develop within those bottoms of those ditches are not regulated wetlands. And this holds until, if this is the case, those ditches intercept another type of wetland, more of a natural type of wetland that isn't associated with those ditches. Then down gradient from that wetland, any wetlands that develop within the bottoms of those ditches are potentially now regulated, assuming that they eventually connect to surface waters of the state in some way. So I don't run into this often, but I have from time to time. Similar situation where if you have upland agricultural areas and you have ditches or drains that were constructed in those upland being the key word, areas, and they only drain upland, then any wetlands that develop in the bottoms of those drains or ditches would not be regulated wetlands. Just a note, it's very uncommon to see large, the big, deep and wide kind of trapezoidal linear wetlands or stream-like features qualify for this, because they're oftentimes draining at least some other wetlands or portions of wetlands in the landscape, as well as that upland. This is different than the agricultural drain exemption for maintenance activities. I'm not going to get into that. It's a different aspect. So this is just an example, kind of a real world example from a couple years ago of that situation. We had this fairly big trapezoidal ditch, drain, whatever you want to call it, active farm field. You can kind of see the corn up in here, corn and soy up in the ag areas around it. Definite wetland in the bottom of this ditch. This is big. This is probably like 10, maybe 15 feet wide at the bottom. Sedges, wetland grasses, all kinds of things. You can see some willows down a ways. So this was a real world situation where, from a couple years ago, a WIP, where the consultant was interested to know, first of all, I should tell you, we were standing maybe, for that photo, standing maybe right in here, looking westward. I think this is probably the willow. And eventually this would go, you can see a little bit of the signature going to an actual stream, permanent stream there. So the first question was, is this drain, whatever you want to call it, actually a stream? Well, you can see from that photo, but it is not a stream. It doesn't have the actual, bed and scouring or anything like that a stream would have. It does, I saw the site twice, it does fill up with water. The second time I saw it later in the fall, it was just full of water, and it gently, infiltrates, outward through a couple crushed culverts and things to the stream, but it itself is not a stream. So then the second question was, well, because this is an ag situation, is this actually regulated wetland? And we found that, like many farm fields, right, throughout Michigan, extensively tiled, this field. I did not find any, wetland conditions within the field. Even had some shallow surface swales, which did not have wetland vegetation. May or may not have had some relics, patches of hydric soil, but I found no wetlands in this ag field. Pretty typical. But then we, did some research on this, and you can kind of see, you still kind of see the carbon in this portion of the field, maybe a little bit of saturation here and there. And it was mapped, a lot of this area was mapped by NRCS back in the day as hydric soil. And so a lot of it was probably still relic hydric soil, but regardless, it was mapped as hydric soil. It probably was, part of this was wetland. And this large trapezoidal ditch, which now has a lot of wetland at the bottom of it, was likely built primarily to drain the wetlands on site. And again, this happened many, many decades ago, maybe even before the statute. But again, because that drained wetland, and it wasn't just built to drain only upland, then it is potentially still regulated. The bottom of this, the wetlands that occur within this big trapezoidal drain are potentially still regulated because they were built to very likely drain wetland conditions. All right, folks, I think this is the last slide I have. Other types of incidentally created wetlands would be, and again, this is pretty obscure, but I have run into it. Any areas that are basically sewage treatment lagoons, sewage treatment facilities. This was a site we had up near Big Rapids a few years ago, completely cut off, pretty obvious sewage treatment facility, completely cut off from the hydrology around it. We had the WIP covered areas around it. There were some wetlands up in here, but they all drained to a lot of them drained to a stream. We didn't even consider these as wetlands that could be regulated. And even the open water, large areas of, maybe it's open water, who knows what it was. Again, we just ignore that if it's part of an actual sewage treatment facility. Also, situations like this would crop up with cooling, storing of water for power plants. Again, you just ignore those as potential wetlands. Okay, I guess we're at the end here. So some of the options, for consultants and others out there, some of this stuff can be confusing and it's tough to wrap your mind around sometimes. You always have the option of contacting your local district EGLE staff. And, of course, we're all busy, but we are hiring more staff. So that's a good thing. You have the option of pre-application meetings where you can meet on-site or off-site to discuss regulatory issues of wetlands with EGLE staff. And I would say for more of your non-typical situations and things that aren't more or less straightforward, you always have the option of doing a wetland identification program, basically a WIP, level 3 WIP. And we'll come out there and make an assessment. And we always make the jurisdictional call at some point during that. You'll end up getting that jurisdictional call with the WIP report, which includes a map and a letter from us. So I think that's all I got at this point.
Perfect. I really appreciate it, Keto. Quite interesting, and appreciate EGLE putting this out for everybody to listen to. Ann and Amy, you guys got anything else to add?
We've been going through just a second. Okay, sorry, Ann and I are sitting in the same room, so we were getting feedback. So we've been answering, people had a lot of like sort of case specific questions. We've tried to answer those, and then we published some answers in the Q&A for everyone if you want to check those out. And then I guess if anybody has questions that they want Keto to answer during this time frame, we can do that if people want to put them in the Q&A. We did get one that's talking about delineations on sites that have some unauthorized fill and the appropriate way to deal with those. And so I think there's sort of two things there, right? One is, what do you do with the unauthorized fill? Because a lot of times, you know, the department can't do a WIP on a disturbed site like that. You know, if I guess our first suggestion would be to contact your local office and have a conversation, local EGLE office, and have a conversation about the unauthorized fill. But what we would want you to be doing from a delineation standpoint is in your report, delineating out the area that was wetland before the unauthorized fill. And do you have anything to add to that?
Nope, I think that's good.
Okay. Do you have one in the chat you wanna?
Here's an easy one.
Okay, you can go ahead.
So one of the questions in the chat that I think is appropriate for us to answer is, are all jurisdictional calls being required to run through the WIP program? And the answer is no, although that is one easy, sort of straightforward way to get confirmation of the jurisdictional call that you have come up with. But jurisdiction can be confirmed as part of a permit application process, as long as the delineation and the jurisdiction justification are provided as part of a complete application, as well as, you know, wetland delineation, data forms and things like that. But you don't have to go through the WIP program. It's just one very straightforward way that gets you a report confirming that that jurisdictional call and that boundary are accurate for 3 years.
Yeah, and I might add that, yeah, ultimately, of course, you'll get a decision from us, you know, via the WIP. It might sometimes take you longer than it would if you went through a pre-application process or something else, something like that.
So I think, and I guess from my perspective, it's if you think an area is not regulated, and you go into the permit process and EGLE determines it is regulated, you're looking at a significant time delay. So that's where probably the WIP is nearly the only avenue, I think, in terms of determining if a wetland, or confirming that a wetland is not regulated, unless it's clearly not regulated. But if you do call something not regulated and you go into the process, that could be quite a time delay, right? There's no other option from what I can tell.
Yeah, I would agree that can cause delays. Usually what we do is in the correction request, we ask for modifications to the delineation and we can resolve it there. But yes, if we get into a contentious discussion, we might ask the applicant to apply for a WIP.
Okay.
There was a couple more WIP questions. How long does a whip usually take? And I guess I'll let Keto respond, but I think the answer is it depends on what time of year it is and how many people have submitted whips before your application. We do try to get to those, and if Keto gets really busy, we have other staff who can help. But it really depends kind of on the workload of Keto. Keto, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to that. It does vary, of course. And, some of these whips, we had one last year that was over 1,000 acres. A lot of the level 3 whips are, anywhere between 50 and a couple hundred acres. They do take a lot of time. They take a lot of resources, and it's really just me and sometimes I get some help with some other staff for the level 3s and level 2s. But right now, of course, we have a huge, I say huge, it's all relative, but quite a big backlog of whip applications that were submitted, late last fall after the cutoff, growing season was done, and then come in all winter. So next week, I think, last week I was out with staff in a couple days, and yeah, growing season had started. It's still kind of, and we had snow for the last day and a half. So, but yeah, next week we're going full guns right into the whip. I got at least 6 lined up. And again, we're trying to take care of the applications that have been there for a while, came in over the winter time and late fall. Typically, once we get caught up to speed, it's just the way it is. After the application, the process of making sure these applications are complete. I mean, we're not going to typically go out there until they're complete, the whip application. So that might take, we might receive the application to My Waters, and then there's some back and forth, making sure things are complete. We have good maps and data forms and all that. If it's a level 3 whip, we need data forms. We need a decent report. Doesn't have to be exhaustive, but something decent from the consultant for level 3 whips. And if we don't have those, oftentimes we have to pass that up until that is complete. So that's just a note, for you folks to make sure that your whip application is complete, and then we can start scheduling. So we work out, typically we'll be working within a given region, and we'll try to get whips done within that region instead of just running willy-nilly all over the state, because I basically cover the entire state. So we'll do our best to get everything now, and especially the whips, obviously, that have been applications that have been sitting there for a while. So just the planning and scheduling, after we receive your complete whip application, realistically, that's going to take a week to get everything set up. Make sure we can find a date and time where the consultant on a level 3 whip can meet me out there. And then typically I'll have the drafts done the way this goes, typically within a week and a half or so. And that means we always do a GIS map. And for level 3, we'll be using the consultant's data. And if we made some adjustments and, obviously all the regulatory calls, will be on our final map. The drafts will be ready, within a week and a half, but then it kind of has to go through our quality assurance, quality control process where, my supervisor is going to take a look, and then our secretary, eventually puts everything together in a letter map form and sends that out. So realistically, it's at least a month, if not more, from when we receive your complete whip application.
Thanks, Keto. That's great. Go ahead, Ann.
We're getting a lot of questions, so I want to address this first about whether or not this will be recorded or copies of the presentation will be available. We have recorded the presentation today, and we will be sending that out to all registered attendees for this. But we will not be providing the slides as a PDF separately. It'll just be the recording.
I think what we'll do is we'll put that on either an MWA's website or on a YouTube video, an MWA channel. So we'll get that to people though, the recording.
Okay. So Stu had a question about Keto's point about not delineating out tiny areas of wetland or tiny areas of upland. And he wanted to know if the rule of thumb was still good from when he was back in the department a long time ago. And he was saying, 100 square foot is what we're kind of talking about. I think Stu, that's a reasonable square footage that you wouldn't want to delineate out of an upland area or a wetland area. So I wouldn't say that is something we have written down anywhere, but I think that's fairly reasonable.
Yeah, Amy, I think you're right. That's what we've pretty much used the last, 9+ years that I've been involved.
Yeah.
Around a 10 by 10 feet situation.
Yeah. And then there was a question about pre-apps not being used to make jurisdictional calls. So we do say that you need a WIP if you want your boundaries reviewed, and you basically, you need like a level 3 review of the wetlands, but we will tell you in a pre-app whether you need a permit or not. So basically, if you have a wetland, you're not sure if it's regulated or not, you can come in with a pre-app and we'll tell you whether or not you need a permit to do activities in that wetland. Okay, you have another one, Anne, that you want to take on? There is a question here about stream segments. I don't think we're going to get into how to identify streams in this talk, but we are talking about trying to do a future webinar on that. It's really hard to get good pictures of difficult stream calls, but we're starting to work on that, and I guess stay tuned. We'll try to do a webinar on that in the future.
And I think that the stream segments can regulate wetland regardless of where they're at. If they're in the wetland or adjacent to the wetland, stream's a stream. So anything within 500 feet or surface water connection, right?
Yes, that is true.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. You guys are all good. You got anything else?
I don't see anything else. We're responding privately to a couple people who had really detailed sort of case specific questions, but I think that's probably it. I want to thank Keto for doing the presentation. I really appreciate Keto spending the time and doing this, and we'll try to continue doing these kind of trainings in the future.
Yeah, well, we appreciate it, and MWA appreciates it, and our members. It's been really interesting and great presentation, Keto, and you're right on time. So very good. One thing I wanted to say is we are trying to schedule a conference, another 3-day conference. I think people really enjoy those. We're probably looking at next fall, if not the following year. So we've got some timing issues we got to work through and get past the COVID, which hopefully we're moving towards. So I appreciate everybody for attending. We will get the recording as soon as possible. Give us a few days or a week to get that figured out, but we'll get that back to everybody. Check out the classes and sign up to the ones you want to attend. Let us know if there's additional classes you'd like to see. The classes are extremely popular. The focus of MWA from the beginning has been to offer high quality wetland classes, and I think we've successfully done that. So if you haven't taken a course from MWA, you should try it out, and I think people really enjoy having them. And we try to offer the best we can do, and we try to offer the classes that people want to see. So I appreciate it, and thank you, Keto and Amy and Ann, and everybody else. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks, guys.